Darnell Jackson believed in rhythm. It was how he managed a classroom full of 8th graders every single day. He had learned long ago that you couldn't always control the chaos, but you could find a beat in it, a cadence that kept things moving forward. Teaching history in Savannah, Georgia, meant wrangling distracted teenagers more interested in their TikTok feeds than the causes of the Civil War. Some days, it felt like he was speaking into the wind, but still, he believed in rhythm. Start class with a story, capture their attention with something unexpected. Keep their curiosity alive long enough to get through the lesson. At the end of the day, he was exhausted, but he felt like he'd given something that mattered. Home was supposed to be the other side of that rhythm. His sanctuary, a modest single-story brick house with a porch swing that creaked in the evenings. A patch of lawn he kept trimmed just so, and a driveway just wide enough for his Honda Accord and the occasional visitor. He'd bought it 10 years earlier, after saving every penny he could from teaching and tutoring. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. His father had always told him, owning a home is planting your flag. Nobody can take your peace away unless you hand it to them. Darnell carried those words like a shield. For a while, that shield held. His days might have been a storm, but evenings were calm. Grading papers with a game on the TV, sipping sweet tea on the porch as cicadas sang in the trees. Throwing a ball for Jasper, his golden retriever mix. That was the life he wanted. Quiet, steady, predictable. And then Victoria Whitmore moved in next door. She wasn't unpleasant at first. She introduced herself with a practiced smile. Her blonde hair set perfectly in place, her manicured hand extended like she was sealing a deal. She mentioned quickly, almost casually, that she sat on the HOA board, as though that detail should matter to him. She had moved into a larger house, all white columns and symmetrical hedges. The kind of place that looked plucked from a real estate brochure. From the beginning, she carried herself like the neighborhood was a kingdom, and she was its queen. First time her Lexus SUV appeared in Darnell's driveway, he figured it was an honest mistake. Maybe she had a delivery. Maybe she needed to shuffle cars around. It was a Friday evening, and he was too tired to think much of it. He parked on the street, carried in his briefcase, and decided not to make a fuss. Everyone deserved a little grace. But then, it happened again and again. Each time she had an excuse ready. Just for a moment, she'd say, waving her hand dismissively. The delivery driver needed space. Or, I was dropping something off. Her tone was breezy, as though her explanation should end the conversation. Each time, she smiled a smile that never touched her eyes. At first, Darnell let it slide. He wasn't looking for conflict, but with each passing week, the moments turned into hours. He'd come home after a long day, pull onto his street, and feel his stomach sink the moment he saw that silver SUV squatting in his driveway. Like it belonged there, he began to feel like a guest in his own home. Finally, one evening, after staying late to grade essays on the Reconstruction era, he pulled up hungry, bone-tired, ready to collapse onto his couch, only to see her Lexus, parked diagonally across his driveway, blocking his garage. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He sat there for a long moment, breathing slowly, willing himself not to explode. Then he got out, walked up to her door, and knocked. She answered with a glass of wine in her hand, her smile already condescending. "Darnell," she said, dragging his name like he was a child caught misbehaving. "What's the problem?" "Your car's in my driveway again," he said, voice steady. "Oh, I just needed space for a delivery. I figured you wouldn't mind, you always park on the street anyway." Her tone carried the same entitlement he'd heard from 100 students who thought rules were suggestions. But this wasn't a classroom, and he wasn't their teacher. This was his home. "I do mind," he said, calm but firm. "This is my property. I've asked you before, I need you to stop." Her laugh was sharp, dismissive. "Seriously, you're making a fuss about a few feet of pavement. Don't be so uptight. I live right next door. It's not like I'm a stranger." But to Darnell, that was exactly the point. She wasn't a stranger. She was his neighbor, and neighbors were supposed to respect one another. He clenched his jaw, nodded once, and walked back to his house. But that night, his father's words echoed differently. "Nobody can take your peace away unless you hand it to them." Had he been handing it away all along? The next morning, he called the HOA office, though he knew what the answer would be. A bored voice told him what he expected. "Unless there's physical damage, sir, we can't really intervene. Have you tried talking to her?" He let out a dry laugh. That's all he'd been doing. They offered to send a courtesy email, but he knew it would go straight into Victoria's recycling bin. He thanked the woman and hung up. He realized he'd have to handle this himself. That evening, he placed one last note on her windshield in bold black marker. "Do not park here again." When he came home the next day, the note was gone, and her Lexus was back, crooked, blocking his garage as if she had planted it there deliberately. Darnell parked on the street. He stared at the SUV for a long moment, his chest rising and falling. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had saved weeks ago. A local towing company. The dispatcher on the other end was brisk. "Private property. Yes, you..." "The owner, I am. Got proof?" "I do." "Then we'll be there in 20. Darnell stood on his porch as the tow truck arrived, orange lights flashing in the dusk. The driver hopped out, nodded at him, then at the Lexus. "This the one?" "Yes, she's parked in your space." "Yes, then she's gone." The driver moved with practiced efficiency, hooking chains, lifting the SUV with mechanical certainty. Within minutes, the car was off the ground, wheels locked, and then disappearing down the street behind the rumbling truck. Darnell folded his arms and let out a long breath. He didn't feel smug. He didn't feel triumphant. What he felt was relief, a weight sliding off his shoulders. For the first time in months, he had acted instead of asking. An hour later came the pounding. The door shook beneath Victoria's fists. Darnell didn't rush. He stood slowly, stretched his arms, made her wait. When he opened the door, she stood in silk pajamas and flip-flops, hair mussed, fury etched into her face. "Where is my car?" she snapped. Darnell tilted his head. "You mean the one illegally parked in my driveway? Don't play games with me, Darnell. Where is it?" "Towed," he said simply. "Sunshine Towing on River Street. You can pick it up after you pay the fee." Her mouth fell open, then twisted into a sneer. "You'll pay for this. Do you know who I am? I'm on the HOA board. I have connections." "Good for you," he said calmly. "But your car isn't my concern anymore." He shut the door. She stood outside for 10 minutes, shouting, threatening, switching between rage and self-pity. She even called the police. When officers arrived, they barely looked at her. They knocked on Darnell's door, asked for proof, and he handed them his deed. The officer nodded, then turned to her. "Ma'am, he's within his rights. If you want your car back, you'll need to pay the impound fee." The look on her face was almost enough to make him smile. Almost, but he knew it wasn't over. People like Victoria didn't back down. They doubled down. The week after the first tow felt like a storm cloud lingering over the cul-de-sac. Victoria's Lexus had returned from the impound lot, and the way she parked it in her own driveway, angled just so, seemed to scream defiance. But she wasn't done. She didn't believe in losing quietly. Darnell noticed the change almost immediately. Flyers began appearing taped to mailboxes around the neighborhood. They were printed on glossy paper, with bold red letters asking, "Is this the community we want?" Beneath the headline, in smaller print, the words accused him of hostility, of being the kind of neighbor who called tow trucks instead of resolving issues like an adult. His name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. Then came the HOA letters. They arrived in his mailbox with startling regularity. One claimed his porch plants were in violation of community aesthetics. Another said his garbage bins had been left out too long. A third complained the paint on his mailbox was fading. Darnell almost laughed when he read them. The same ferns had sat on his porch for 2 years. The garbage bins had been brought in the same day they were emptied, and his mailbox looked exactly as it always had. These weren't violations. They were harassment, dressed as bureaucracy. He could have ignored them, but each letter was a reminder. She was trying to chip away at his peace. And then, one evening as he watered his lawn, a white security SUV pulled up, red and blue lights flashing. A tall officer stepped out, adjusting his belt like he had something important to do. "Double quote, sir. Do you live here?" the officer asked. Darnell frowned. "Yes, why?" "We received a call about suspicious activity." That word, suspicious. It had followed him all his life in one form or another. He turned his head, and there she was, Victoria, standing on her porch, with her arms crossed, feigning innocence. Darnell let out a slow breath, turned back to the officer, and said, "So watering my lawn is suspicious now?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Look, sir, I save it." Darnell cut him off. He nodded toward Victoria's house. "You know exactly who called. Tell her to find a new hobby." The officer sighed, gave a small nod, and returned to his SUV. Victoria smiled faintly, as if she had won some small victory, but she hadn't. Not really. Darnell walked up her porch steps calmly. She blinked in mock surprise when he appeared. "Oh, Darnell, is everything all right?" "I saw security, hoped nothing serious was happening." "You know exactly why they were here," he said, folding his arms. She gasped theatrically. "Reggie, no need to be rude. We have a duty to watch out for our neighborhood, don't we?" He studied her face. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to lose his temper, to give her something she could use against him. Instead, he smirked, calm, controlled, amused. "I'm done playing games. Victoria," he said, voice low and steady. "I gave you more chances than you deserved, but you keep pushing, so let's see what happens when I push back." For the first time, her eyes flickered with something uncertain. The second tow came on a Saturday. The sun was bright, the air buzzing with the promise of summer, and Darnell's family was on their way over for a cookout. He'd spent the morning marinating ribs, setting up folding chairs on the porch, and looking forward to an afternoon of laughter and ease. As he pulled onto his street, humming along with the radio, his mood shattered. There it was again, her silver Lexus parked squarely in his driveway, blocking the garage door completely. It was bold, deliberate, disrespectful. He sat in his car for a moment, staring at the SUV. Then he put the car in park, stepped out, and dialed the number he had saved. "It's Jackson again," he told the dispatcher. "Same address, same car." The dispatcher chuckled. "Got it. Be there in 15. Darnell smiled, carried his folding chairs onto the porch, and sat down to wait. He leaned back, arms crossed, sipping from his water bottle as if he had all the time in the world. The tow truck rolled in quickly, the driver grinning as he hopped out. "We doing this again?" "Looks like it," Darnell replied. "Some people never learn." With practiced efficiency, the driver hooked the Lexus, chains clanking as the vehicle lifted off the ground. That's when Victoria came storming out of her house. She screamed like someone was stealing her child. "Stop, what are you doing?" Darnell didn't move. "You parked in my driveway again." "I had guests." "There was no street parking. Not my problem." Her hands balled into fists. "You're being petty, Darnell. I told you I would have moved it." He shook his head slowly. "You've told me that before. And yet, here we are." Her face flushed crimson. She hissed, "You don't understand what you're doing. I have connections. I can make things very difficult for you." For the first time, Darnell laughed. A real laugh, low and steady. "Oh, Victoria, I don't think you understand what's happening here." He gestured toward the tow truck. "Your car, it's already gone." She whirled around and saw the Lexus halfway down the street, wheels locked, vanishing behind the rumbling truck. She shrieked, a sound that cut through the quiet neighborhood. "You're going to regret this," she screamed. Darnell rose from his chair, brushed off his jeans, and said, calmly, "No, Victoria, you are." He turned, walked back into his house, and closed the door just as his family arrived, arms full of food and laughter spilling through the entryway. Neighbors had gathered on porches to watch. Some whispered, some smiled, Some clapped softly as the Lexus disappeared. And just like that, the story began to spread. By Monday morning, Victoria was desperate to control the narrative. Emails from the HOA board arrived in every residence inbox, painting the conflict as a neighborly dispute that had escalated unnecessarily. The wording was vague but pointed, designed to make Darnell seem like the aggressor. Flyers reappeared on mailboxes, this time laminated to withstand the rain. "Do we tow our neighbors instead of talking to them?" the headline asked. But it was too late. The second tow had been too public. Too many eyes had seen her screaming in the street. Too many people had their own stories of her petty power plays. Darnell didn't have to defend himself. The neighborhood was already whispering the truth. At the grocery store, a father approached him. "Saw what happened, man. She's been a nightmare for years. You did what we all wish we could have done." At the hardware store, an older woman shook his hand. "She'll find me $100 for a wind chime once. Good for you." Even at school, parents stopped him to say quietly, "We're glad someone finally stood up." The shift was happening. Victoria was losing her grip, and everyone could see it. When the HOA held its monthly meeting, Darnell decided to attend for the first time. The community room was crowded, tension thick in the air. He sat near the front, arms folded, calm. Victoria sat across from him, jaw tight, eyes narrowed like knives. The meeting began with routine announcements, budget updates, landscaping contracts. Then, a board member cleared his throat. "We need to address a complaint that has been filed regarding misuse of private property." Victoria straightened, ready to play the victim. But the board member continued, "The complaint is against Victoria Whitmore." A hush fell over the room. Victoria's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" The board member looked down at his notes. "We've had multiple reports of you harassing residents, misusing HOA communications, and filing retaliatory complaints." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm the one being harassed." Another board member, an older woman, sighed. "Victoria, we've all seen the pattern. You've called security for trivial matters. You've used your position to intimidate. This isn't about one driveway. This is about respect." Victoria looked around, searching for support, but found none. Her allies were silent, their gazes lowered. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Darnell leaned back in his chair, saying nothing, simply watching. He didn't need to speak. The truth was speaking for him. That night, Victoria lost her seat on the HOA board. When Darnell walked home, the cicadas were loud in the trees, the air heavy with summer. He felt lighter than he had in months. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't fought dirty, he hadn't lost his dignity. He had simply stood firm, again and again, until the truth revealed itself. But he knew it wasn't over. People like Victoria didn't vanish quietly. They lingered, desperate for one last chance to hold on to what was slipping through their fingers. He didn't expect the silence to last. It never does with people who've fallen in love with their own power. For days after the HOA meeting, Victoria's house looked like a stage after the curtain. Lights off, porch empty, blinds closed. Darnell went about his life deliberately runs along the marsh. Fourth period lectures on how rights without responsibility rot from the inside. Evenings spent on the porch swing with Jasper curled at his feet. He told himself not to think about her, but a part of him tracked the rhythms of a neighbor he had learned to read too well. On a Wednesday afternoon, he came home to something that felt absurd enough to be comic if it weren't so pointed. His trash cans were gone. Not knocked over. Not a few feet away. Gone. He scanned the street, confused, until he saw the pair of them, side by side, behind Victoria's house, tucked neatly by her air conditioning unit like trophies. He laughed, an involuntary sound, half amusement, half disbelief, then pulled out his phone and took 3 photos from 3 angles. He didn't knock, he didn't leave a note, he didn't raise his voice. He sent the pictures to himself, to a cloud folder labeled Property Docs and Proof, and to one of his brothers who replied in seconds, "Want me to swing by?" Darnell typed back, "I got it." He walked to her front door and knocked anyway, because some scripts deserve to be performed exactly once before you refuse to ever act in them again. She opened the door after a long pause, her expression bare for the first time, no brittle smile, no feigned surprise. If exhaustion had a look, it was there. "You want to tell me why my trash cans are in your backyard?" he asked, holding up his phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said reflexively, the words flat and automatic, like a line she'd rehearsed without believing. "I have pictures, Victoria. Let's not do this." He didn't move, didn't loom, didn't push the door with his foot. He simply stood there, steady in his own doorway, like a man who knew the difference between a boundary and a dare. For a moment, she seemed to weigh the usefulness of denial, and found it too thin to hold her. She said nothing. "You've lost," he said finally. And there was no gloating in it, just the simple diagnosis of someone who had seen endings before. "You can't find me. You can't call security for a man watering his lawn. The board won't carry your grudges, and now you're stealing trash cans. This isn't power, it's smallness." Her jaw tightened, a flash in her eyes that was half rage, half something like grief. She shut the door without answering. He let her. Then he walked into the afternoon sun, retrieved his cans with the quiet ease of a man picking up what already belonged to him, rolled them back into place, and went inside to make dinner. The next morning, he filed an official complaint with the HOA, organized, documented, indisputable. He attached the photos of the cans, copies of the letters, dates of the security calls, and a short summary written in the same clear language he used to grade essays. Statements of fact, no adjectives, heavy with heat. At the end, he added something that surprised even him, a suggestion for a neighborhood code of conduct the board could adopt. No personal use of HOA communications, clear guidelines around security calls. A basic reminder that the first step in resolving conflict is to talk, like neighbors instead of strategists. He submitted it all and went to teach about Frederick Douglass's belief that power concedes nothing without a demand. Wondering whether Victoria had ever learned what real power looked like, or if she had ever seen it when it stood calmly across from her. By Friday, the board responded. They had voted to remove Victoria from her position. They were grateful for the documentation and would be reviewing his policy suggestions. The message read like official language, careful and measured, but underneath the restraint he could feel it. Relief. It was there, in the speed of the vote, in the efficiency of the phrasing, in the way neighbors began to lift their hands from their own small fears. People in love with peace recognized the first clear path back to it. He didn't see her for a week. Then one evening, as he came home from school, she was on her porch with a stack of cardboard boxes and a roll of packing tape. The sight didn't make him happy. It didn't make him sad either. It simply felt inevitable. Some storms exhaust themselves and roll back toward the ocean, not because they've been defeated, but because there's nowhere left for them to go. A few days later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. It had the artificial brightness of a retail smile, new listing. Beneath the bold font, the grass looked duller than usual, as if even the yard were tired. "Strange how quiet it is," Mr. Alvarez from 3 houses down said as he paused on his evening walk. He and Darnell stood at the edge of the sidewalk, Jasper sniffing the hydrangeas. "Quiet feels different when you didn't have to earn it every day," Darnell said. "She'll find my wife for a wind chime." Mr. Alvarez confided a story Darnell had heard before in a dozen versions with different objects. A bird feeder, a pair of porch chairs, a boy's bicycle. It turned out the neighborhood had been carrying its stories like small stones in their pockets, and all it took was one person emptying his hands for everyone else to find their own courage. "You did right," Mr. Alvarez added. "Not because you won, because you stayed yourself while you did it." After that conversation, Darnell stood on his porch for a long time, watching the light change. He thought about how easy it is to confuse loudness with strength, how easy to mistake control for respect. He had been tempted God. He had been tempted to meet disrespect with its own language. But every time he had chosen calm, it wasn't to be polite. It was defiance of a different kind, the kind that says, "I won't let your chaos dictate the terms of my dignity." His students noticed the difference in him too, though they didn't know why. He taught reconstruction with a new edge, not bitter but clarifying, the way a teacher becomes when life delivers a case study that keeps breathing outside the classroom. Rights are not the same as privileges, he told them. Privileges crumble when they're mistaken for birthrights. Rights become brittle when no one practices the responsibility that holds them up. A girl in the back row, usually quiet, raised her hand. "So what do you do when someone keeps crossing your line?" He thought of a silver Lexus parked brazenly across a driveway and said, "You draw it again in firmer ink, and then you stand on it without moving. People will test the line. They might even mock you for drawing it. But if you've drawn it with care and truth, they will learn." Because he'd submitted the code of conduct with his complaint, the HOA invited him to the next meeting, not as a witness, but as a voice. He arrived early, sat in the back, and listened. When they asked him to speak, he stood and said that rules serve communities best when they help people recognize each other's humanity, and worst when they become weapons. He proposed a simple process: direct conversation first, mediation second, enforcement only when the first to fail. The board voted to adopt the guidelines. It wasn't a sweeping reform, it didn't make headlines. But it changed something important. It made the default posture of the neighborhood a conversation instead of a citation. He went home that night through air that smelled like rain and felt something unclench in his chest. Victoria's house sat dim. He didn't know where she was going. He didn't wish her ill. If she learned anything at all from the last months, he hoped it was the shape of power when it doesn't need to shout. On the Saturday before the open house signs went up, his youngest nephew, Theo, came by with his skateboard and a mouthful of questions. "Uncle D, you really got that lady's car towed twice?" Theo's eyes gleamed with the wrong kind of hero worship, the kind that loves the spectacle more than the meaning. "I did," Darnell said. "But listen to what mattered." He told Theo about the notes he'd written, polite and clear. About the conversations that felt like speaking into wind. About the phone call to the HOA that taught him the difference between power and influence. About the first toe and how relief isn't the same as revenge. About the second toe and the way a boundary enforced becomes a lesson for more than one person. And then about the meeting where truth walked in on steady legs and sat down like it had paid for its seat. So the lesson is, always call the tow truck. Theo grinned. The lesson is, draw the line. Speak once with kindness, speak twice with clarity, and on the third time, act. But even when you act, keep your voice. Don't hand it to the person trying to take it. Theo nodded slowly, as if something in the phrasing reached past the comic book version of the story to the reality of it. Later, as they ate barbecue on the porch with the family, Theo helped Jasper chase a tennis ball until dusk, and Darnell felt a tenderness for the ways boys learn what manhood is supposed to look like. He wished he could give every student, every nephew, every young black kid in his classroom 1,000 examples of power without swagger, dignity without apology. When the open house weekend arrived, strangers drifted up and down the walkway to Victoria's front door. Some looked at the view, some peered into the garage, some stood in the yard quietly doing the math of mortgages in their heads. Darnell mowed his grass and waved when people waved. He did not perform. He did not participate in gossip. He nodded at the realtor, who had the bright, practiced friendliness of people who sell thresholds for a living. That evening, Mrs. Flowers from the corner house ambled over with her cane, tapping the sidewalk, and said, "I've lived on this block 32 years. I've seen 4 HOAs, 6 presidents, 2 recessions, and 1 hurricane that turned our street into a river. Do you know what survives all that?" She didn't wait for an answer. People who take care of what's theirs without trying to own what isn't. He thought about that sentence all week. It was the kind of line you could slide into a lesson plan and let it do slow work. The for sale sign sprouted a red sticker under contract one morning before school. He noticed it on his way out with a travel mug of coffee and a stack of quizzes. He stood for a second longer than he meant to and let the sight complete a circle in him. Not triumph, not relief alone. Something more like a quiet seal pressed on a letter already written. On her last day, movers hauled boxes while the realtor directed traffic with a clipped efficiency. Victoria came out only once, head down, keys in hand, walked to the curb, and stared at the street like it might give her back what it had taken. For a moment, she lifted her eyes toward Darnell's porch. He raised a hand in a courteous, neutral acknowledgement to live near someone long enough, and the rituals matter, even at the end. She didn't wave back. She climbed into a car that wasn't the Lexus and drove away. Neighborhoods do something odd when a source of noise exits. They don't erupt into celebration. They don't sing, they breathe. And the first breath sounds like sprinklers ticking in a rhythm no one had noticed in months. A teenager laughed without glancing over his shoulder. Someone put out a lawn chair and let the evening settle in. Peace, real peace, returned like a bird you stop chasing and start feeding. 2 weeks later, the board held a small community event, coffee and pastries under the shade of a live oak in the common area. The flyer called it Neighbor Day, which was corny and perfect. People came with toddlers and dogs and the sort of tentative smiles you carry when you're testing if a place can be kind again. The new interim HOA president thanked everyone for coming, mentioned rule revisions in a way that didn't feel like a lecture, and then did something that surprised Darnell. She acknowledged him by name, not as a hero, but as a neighbor who had done the patient, necessary work of reminding everyone where the lines were. He didn't step forward. He didn't bow his head. He raised a hand as if to say, "We're all good," and returned to his coffee. After a while, folks drifted over. To chat, they told stories about the small tyrannies they'd swallowed, and how those had made their own homes feel smaller than they ought to. One man said, "I stayed out of it because I didn't want to make waves." Turns out, silence made bigger waves than speaking up would have. They laughed at that truth, because laughter is how people admit something hard without turning it into confession. Later that afternoon, a father brought his son to Darnell and said the boy's history teacher had made homework feel like stories instead of chores. The boy, shy in a baseball cap, asked if Darnell had any book recommendations. Darnell lit up the way teachers do and wrote 2 titles on a napkin in big block letters. As he handed it over, he realized it was the first truly ordinary conversation he'd had on that lawn in a long time. Ordinary as in human. Ordinary as insane. At school, he started a small after-hours club called Roots and Rights. It wasn't formal 3 kids at first, then 9, then a dozen. They watched clips of documentaries. They read short passages Douglas and Pally Murray and Brian Stevenson, and then talked about what respect looks like when you're the one being denied it and when you're the one tempted to withhold it. He didn't talk about Victoria by name, but he didn't need to. The kids understood patterns when you gave them the tools, and the conversations made them braver and gentler at the same time, which is a rare saving twin. One evening in September, as the heat loosened its hold on Savannah and a breeze pushed the scent of river and marsh through the screens, a knock came. Not pounding, not urgent. 3 even taps. He opened the door to find a couple in their 30s in trying to be casual real estate smiles. They introduced themselves, Marcus and Keisha Harris. "We're moving in next door," Marcus said, glancing at the for sale sign, stumped like it might tell a joke, "closing tomorrow." He invited them onto the porch. They talked about where they were from, what they did, whether Jasper shed more in summer or winter summer. Always summer, the best routes to work at different times of day. Eventually, Keisha said softly, "We heard a little something about tension." She trailed off, polite enough to leave it open. "It's quiet now," Darnell said. "We keep it that way, by talking to each other like we mean it." Marcus laughed. "That's the line, right there." They asked if there was anything they should know about the HOA. He told them honestly. There were good people trying to keep order without turning it into control. There were new guidelines. There was a culture slowly shifting toward conversation first, and if you need anything, he added, "I'm right here. We do better when we do it together." They moved in 3 days later. The first weekend, the neighborhood organized what the flyer called a clean and green day, picking up litter by the retention pond, repainting a scuffed bench by the walking trail, cutting back a tangle of overgrown jasmine that had devoured a fence. Darnell brought a cooler of water and a stack of work gloves. Marcus arrived with a power washer, which made everyone marvel at the way a grey slab of sidewalk could turn white in seconds. Keisha set up a folding table with lemonade and a speaker that played Motown, softly enough to make the work feel less like a chore and more like a scene from the kind of life people imagine when they say the word neighborhood. At one point, Mrs. Flowers took a seat on the newly cleaned bench and watched two kids draw hopscotch squares. "You know the difference between rules and culture?" she asked. "No one in particular. Rules tell you what happens if you break something. Culture tells you how not to break it in the first place." Darnell and Marcus looked at each other and smiled. The two kids drew a crooked square and declared it perfect. Time did what it does when it's given a riverbed to follow it carved out habits. The stories about Victoria didn't vanish, but they lost their sting and turned into lessons. When new neighbors asked what had happened, people said simply, "We reset the lines," and left it at that. The HOA sent fewer letters and more reminders phrased like invitations instead of summons. Security showed up only when it needed to. On summer nights, you could hear teenagers laughing without a quick hush, and sprinklers clicking on made a sound that felt like punctuation instead of alarm. There were still small frictions. There always are when people live close enough to borrow sugar and grievances at the same time. But when the small things came, noise too late, a car too near a mailbox, a yard that needed attention, took a breath and knocked on each other's doors, it turned out that most irritations evaporated when you asked a question before you made a judgment. Every so often, Darnell's mind replayed a single image, a silver Lexus in his driveway, angled like a dare. It didn't stir anger anymore. If anything, it sharpened his gratitude. For the porch swing, for the dog asleep at his feet, for the rhythm of a life he had chosen and defended without becoming someone he didn't want to be. In October, the Roots and Rights Club planned a small service project. The kids voted to repaint two faded crosswalks near the middle school, partnering with the city's volunteer program. On the morning they went out with reflective vests and rollers. A few neighbors from the cul-de-sac showed up to help. Marcus held a bucket. Keisha handed out granola bars. Mr. Alvarez told a joke that landed with groans and a smile. Someone took a photo of the group lined up along the bright white lines, rollers in hand, and later sent it to Darnell with a caption, "We take care of what's ours." That night, he sat on the porch with a notebook open, jotting bullet points for the next day's lesson. He paused, pen hovering, as a thought settled with the weight of something that had been waiting its turn. People think respect is won by winning. Sometimes it is, but more often, respect is grown by repetition, the repetition of showing up as yourself. The repetition of saying no without anger. The repetition of recognizing someone's humanity, even when they're borrowing against it. He wrote the sentence down, then another. Entitlement is loud because it's afraid. Dignity is quiet because it doesn't need an audience. He closed the notebook as the first cool wind in weeks stirred the oak leaves. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed, that wild, clean sound that makes you believe in second chances. Jasper lifted his head for a moment, then sighed and returned to sleep. The doorbell rang once pole-lit, a paired chime. He opened the door to find a man in a city uniform with a clipboard. "Mr. Jackson, I just wanted to drop by and say the crosswalk project looked great. Kids did good work. Also, the HOA sent over those new community guidelines. They're using them as a model for 2 other neighborhoods now. Thought you'd like to know?" Darnell thanked him, accepted the paper, and stood for a long minute in his doorway, reading a document that was both unremarkable and quietly radical. A line about security calls requiring a description of behavior rather than a description of people. A note that neighbor disputes start with conversation. A clause that barred board members from using communications for private grievances. Nothing earth-shaking, everything necessary. He pinned the paper to a corkboard in the kitchen. next to a grocery list and a student's thank you note that still made him smile. It felt right there, among the small proofs that life and work and care coexist in the same square footage. A week later, he woke before dawn. Unable to sleep for reasons that weren't reasons at all, just the body's mysterious clock deciding to ring early. He made coffee and stepped outside. The street was washed clean by night. Sky, a deep pre-dawn blue. He listened to the stillness, the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of rest. He thought about his father, the man who taught him that you plant your flag without stabbing it into other people's ground, that you stand your ground without stomping on your neighbor's toes, that you draw a line and then become it. Sunrise drew a thin line of orange across the horizon. He breathed in and let it out. He didn't know where Victoria had landed, or whether she'd learned anything from the friction she'd created and the mirror it held up. He knew only this: he had learned something worth keeping. You cannot control who tries to take your peace. You can only decide whether you will hand it to them. He felt ready for his students, for the day's lesson, for a life that was ordinary in all the ways that build a person's strength. He went inside to wake the house, to feed Jasper, to tie a tie that would be slightly crooked by lunch, and to smile at that small imperfection because it meant he had spent his morning energy where it mattered. Later that afternoon, as the final bell rang and the last student drifted out with a promise to actually read tonight, he gathered his things and headed home. On the drive, Spanish moss lifted and fell from branches like slow-moving rivers, and the city's old bones glowed in slanted light. He turned onto his street and saw nothing unusual, which is to say, he saw everything he'd fought for. A clear driveway, a neighbor waving from a porch, a new family wrestling a grill out of a box on their lawn. He parked, stepped out, and stood for a second simply to memorize the view. He had not changed the world. He had changed his corner of it. Sometimes that's how the world change, corner by corner, line by line, with people who refuse to be made small by other people's smallness. The quiet kind of power. The kind that builds. Inside, Jasper thumped his tail against the kitchen cabinets like a metronome. Darnell scratched him behind the ears, set his papers on the table, and poured a glass of water. He opened the back door and let the evening in. The porch swing creaked when he sat. He took out his notebook, not to write a speech, not to draft another complaint, but to jot 3 simple words at the top of a fresh page: keep showing up. He underlined them once, closed the notebook, and watched the light fade from the yard. He'd claimed, not once with a shout, but over and over with a steady yes to the life he wanted to live. And when darkness finally settled, it felt like a benediction instead of a threat. The kind of ending that is really a beginning, the kind that reminds you that rhythm isn't about control, it's about choosing your beat and walking it, day after day, until your feet remember on their own. The lesson from this story is, patience and self-respect are never signs of weakness. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand firm on their boundaries to change an entire community. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are many more meaningful and inspiring stories waiting for you.